Wars of South American Independence. In the winter of 1817, an army of ragged soldiers stood at the base of a mountain range, so tall, so brutal, that no invading force had ever crossed it with an entire army intact. The peaks of the Andes rose over 13,000 feet into thin, freezing air. Mules froze solid where they stood. Men lost fingers, then toes, then their lives, one by one, to the cold. And yet, this army chose to climb anyway. Not because it was easy, because it was impossible. Because the Spanish Empire, watching the coastal roads, never imagined anyone insane enough to attack from above the clouds. This is the story of how a continent tore itself free from 300 years of colonial rule. Not through one revolution, but through a decade and a half of interlocking wars, betrayals, alliances, and the sheer stubbornness of men who refused to accept that the way things were was the way they had to stay. This is the story of the Wars of South American Independence, the empire that seemed eternal. By the early 1800s, Spain had ruled most of South America for nearly 3 centuries. Its empire stretched from the Caribbean coast down to Patagonia, an empire built on silver, sugar, and the labor of millions who had no say in how it was run. At the top of colonial society sat the Peninsulares, men born in Spain itself, who held nearly every position of real power. Below them stood the Criollos, people of Spanish descent but born in the Americas. Wealthy, educated, ambitious, and permanently locked out of the highest offices simply because of where they'd been born. That resentment simmered for generations. It might have simmered for generations more. Then, in 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte did something that cracked the entire system open. He invaded Spain, he forced the Spanish king to abdicate, and he placed his own brother on the throne. Suddenly, the empire had no legitimate king. Local governing councils, juntas, sprang up across Spain and its colonies, each claiming to rule in the true king's name until he could be restored. And in the colonies, Criollo leaders looked at these juntas and asked a dangerous question. If Spain itself no longer had a king, why should we take orders from Spain at all? The crack had appeared. Now it was only a matter of who would be bold enough to widen it. The first sparks. The uprisings didn't erupt as one unified war. They ignited separately in different corners of the continent, almost like independent fires that would only later merge into a single blaze. In Caracas in 1810, a group of Criollo leaders deposed the Spanish governor and formed their own junta. Among the young men swept up in that movement was a wealthy, restless aristocrat named Simón Bolívar. Bolívar was not yet the legend he would become. He was fiery, impatient, and prone to grand declarations that made older, more cautious revolutionaries nervous. But he carried something rarer than caution, an unshakable conviction that South America's freedom was not just possible, it was inevitable. Venezuela's first attempt at independence collapsed within 2 years, crushed by royalist forces and a devastating earthquake that the church declared divine punishment for rebellion. Bolívar barely escaped with his life. Most men would have called that the end of the story. Bolívar called it the beginning. Meanwhile, far to the south, in Buenos Aires, a different kind of revolution was taking shape. Quieter, more methodical, led by a man whose talents lay not in speeches but in the cold discipline of military strategy. José de San Martín. San Martín had spent over 20 years fighting in European wars under the Spanish crown itself. He knew Spanish military tactics from the inside, and he understood something Bolívar was only beginning to grasp, that passion alone doesn't win wars. Preparation does. 2 men, 2 temperaments, 2 ends of the continent, both about to become architects of the same impossible dream, Bolívar's fire. Bolívar returned to Venezuela again and again, refusing to let defeat be final. In 1813, he launched what became known as the Campaña Admirable, the Admirable Campaign, sweeping through Venezuela and retaking Caracas in a lightning offensive. He entered the city to cheering crowds. They gave him a title that would follow him for the rest of his life, El Libertador, the Liberator. But triumph in South America's independence wars rarely lasted. Royalist forces regrouped. Brutal civil conflict tore through the region. made worse by the fact that many enslaved and mixed-race llaneros, plainsmen, initially fought for the Spanish crown, distrustful of Criollo elites who had never fought for their freedom either. Caracas fell again. Bolívar fled into exile, not for the last time. It would have broken most leaders. Instead, in exile in Haiti, Bolívar found an unlikely ally. Haiti's president Alexandre Pétion, leader of the world's only successful slave revolution turned independent nation. Pétion gave Bolívar ships, weapons, and money. His one condition, that Bolívar commit to abolishing slavery in the territories he liberated. Bolívar agreed. It was a promise that would shape the ideological soul of the revolution. No longer just a fight to replace Spanish elites with Criollo elites, but, at least in principle, a fight for genuine liberty. Reinforced, Bolívar returned to South America, and this time he had a plan so audacious that even his own officers questioned his sanity. The crossing. The Spanish held the coasts. They held the cities. They held every road a rational general would use to attack. So Bolívar chose the mountains. In 1819, he led an army of roughly 2,400 men, a mixed force of Venezuelan llaneros and British and Irish volunteers, drawn by the promise of adventure and a cause, on a march across the flooded plains of Casanare and then up into the Andes through the freezing Páramo de Pispa Pass. Conditions were savage. Rain turned to sleet, sleet turned to snow. Horses died by the hundreds. Men who had survived tropical heat their whole lives now froze to death at altitudes they'd never imagined existed. Bolívar pushed them onward because he understood the brutal mathematics of war. The Spanish viceroy in Bogotá believed this route was impossible, which meant it was undefended. When Bolívar's battered army descended from the mountains into New Granada, modern-day Colombia, the Spanish forces were caught completely unprepared. At the Battle of Boyacá on August 7, 1819, Bolívar's exhausted, half-frozen army shattered the royalist force in a matter of hours. 3 days later, Bolívar rode into Bogotá as a liberator. The impossible crossing had worked, and with it, Bolívar didn't just win a battle, he seized the momentum of the entire war. San Martin's patience. While Bolívar burned across the north like wildfire, San Martin was executing a far more deliberate strategy in the south. He understood something crucial. Argentina's independence, declared in 1816, would never be safe as long as Spain held neighboring Peru, the wealthiest, most heavily fortified viceroyalty in South America, and the beating heart of royalist power on the continent. Rather than attack Peru directly through brutal mountain terrain, San Martin spent years methodically building an army in Mendoza, training soldiers, gathering supplies, and negotiating with Chilean revolutionaries. Most notably Bernardo O'Higgins, a Chilean patriot leader who had already suffered his own defeats fighting the Spanish. In 1817, San Martin did what Bolívar would later become famous for. He led an army across the Andes himself, through a different, equally brutal set of mountain passes, catching Spanish forces in Chile completely off guard. At the Battle of Chacabuco, San Martin and O'Higgins crushed the royalist defenders and marched into Santiago. Chile's independence was secured soon after at the Battle of Maipú in 1818. With Chile free, San Martin had the base he needed. His next target was the true prize, Peru, the last great stronghold of Spanish power in South America. The meeting at Guayaquil. By 1820, San Martin had landed forces in Peru and, through a mixture of military pressure and political maneuvering, helped push Spanish authorities out of Lima. Peru declared independence in 1821. But full victory remained elusive. Royalist forces still controlled the Peruvian highlands, dug into terrain that favored defense. San Martin's forces, worn down by years of campaigning, needed reinforcement. And so, in July 1822, two of history's greatest liberators met face-to-face for the first and only time, in the port city of Guayaquil. What was said behind those closed doors, no one recorded in full. But we know the outcome. San Martin emerged from the meeting and shortly after made an extraordinary decision. He withdrew from the independence movement entirely. He resigned his command, left Peru, and eventually sailed to Europe, where he lived out his remaining years in quiet exile, largely away from politics. Historians still debate why. Some argue San Martin recognized that Bolivar's larger army and political power made him the only man capable of finishing the war. Others suggest personal or ideological friction. San Martin favored constitutional monarchy for the new nations, while Bolivar was committed to republics. Whatever the true reason, San Martin made a choice that many leaders in history never make. He stepped aside for the sake of the cause rather than his own legacy. With San Martin gone, the final chapter of the war belonged to Bolivar.
The final reckoning. Bolivar, now commanding combined forces alongside his brilliant and ruthless lieutenant, Antonio José de Sucre, pushed into Peru's interior to finish what San Martin had started. The campaign culminated in two decisive battles. At Junín in August 1824, cavalry clashed in near silence, swords only, no gunfire, in one of the strangest and most intense battles of the war. Then, on December 9, 1824, Sucre led Republican forces against the last major Spanish army in South America at the Battle of Ayacucho. The victory was total. The Spanish viceroy himself was captured. Royal power in South America, after more than 300 years, effectively collapsed in a single afternoon. The territory once called Upper Peru would soon become its own nation. The cost of freedom. The wars had lasted roughly 15 years. They had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Soldiers, civilians, indigenous communities caught between armies that rarely asked their permission before marching through their land. Bolivar dreamed of something even larger than individual independence: Gran Colombia, a unified South American republic that could stand as a single power on the world stage, and eventually a continent-wide confederation of free nations. It didn't survive. Regional rivalries, political exhaustion, and the sheer difficulty of governing such vast, disconnected territory tore Gran Colombia apart within a decade. Bolivar, the man who had liberated 6 nations, died in 1830, poor, ill, and politically isolated, reportedly lamenting that he had plowed the sea. But the sea he plowed did not close back over what he'd done.
Today, the borders of Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina all trace back to campaigns fought by men who crossed mountains that armies were never supposed to cross. Bolivar and San Martin never built the unified continent they imagined. Their new nations would face decades of instability, civil war, and struggles for genuine equality that the revolution alone could not deliver. But the empire that had ruled for 3 centuries, the one that once seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves, was gone. And it was gone because ordinary and extraordinary people alike decided that an impossible climb was still worth making. That's the story South America carries in its flags, its street names, its currencies. A reminder that freedom, once actually seized, has never been handed back. If you want more deep dives into the revolutions, wars, and hidden turning points that shape the modern world, subscribe and turn on notifications, because history's most incredible stories are usually the ones nobody told you about in school.